Hello and welcome to the Lean Dog Agile Explain module on testing. My name is Paul Carvalho and I will be your guide for this topic. A little bit about me: I'm an enterprise and DevOps coach, startup specialist, trainer, consultant, international speaker, and occasional writer. I've worked in IT for over 30 years in many industries, domains, and a variety of technologies and positions. I started off as a dev, and I've worked in many QA roles for over 20 years, including performance tester, security specialist. I was an auditor, director of QA, and more. I was first introduced to Agile over 15 years ago, and I looked at Agile through the quality and testing eyes, knowledge, and experience that I had at the time. So a lot of my colleagues asked me to help bridge the gap for people trying to understand how quality and testing fit into Agile transformations. Interestingly, I see it as Agile that fits into a quality view of the world. So let's take a trip together on this topic of quality and testing in Agile. It's time to look at the way we are getting to where we are going. It's time to step off that skateboard or bicycle and start looking at what it means to get on a motorcycle to really go places. All right, here we go. Bam! Step 0. There is no QA role in Agile. Let's try a quick experiment. Think of your favorite sports team. All right, got one in mind? Okay. Pick one team member and only one team member that you think is responsible for the quality or outcome of the entire game, every game. The one team member who's responsible for the happiness of all the fans, for the success of the team's organization. It's kind of a weird question, right? I mean, because while you might have your star players, it's a team, and one person can't play all the positions and placements on a particular team. It has to be a team effort to have the team outcome. Agile is kind of the same. In Agile, the whole team is responsible for quality. Not one person or role has that responsibility. Making quality someone else's job reinforces a blame culture. That's not Agile. Therefore, the role of QA, quality assurance, is by definition counter-Agile. Let's recall one of the first introductory slides that we had from the first intro section. What do organizations really want? They want a process and culture that facilitates product delivery. The risk takers, the innovators, the experimenters. What does that culture look like? Well, that's relevant in the topic of quality and testing. Let's go back to the definition of culture. A simple way of looking at it is culture is represented by the habits, norms, conversations, and the tolerated behaviors in an organization. It's reflected in our words, our actions, and interactions. What are the norms in your org around who is responsible for quality, around who does the testing, around who we trust to test and why? A little bit about this question is, we're not trying to judge, good, bad, and what's going on. It's just like we're holding up a mirror here. What do you see? What do you hear? Up above where I say the tolerated behaviors is that if you hear a phrase like, testing isn't my job, and you don't stop to correct this, nobody stops to correct this, then you support that action. You support those words. You support that culture, that shift, that it's not my job, it's somebody else's job. Here's an example. A dev thinking about themselves is like, is my code bad? No, the test must be wrong. This is an example of a statement that might come up. And if the dev can push back on the perceived quality of their code by disregarding the tests or the testers, and no one's there to stop them, then you're supporting that behavior. What would be the outcomes that you would get from this kind of a scenario? Let's look at another example. There are no finer QA testers than the clients themselves. So what happens when you make delivery dates and schedules the number one priority and we completely disregard quality? Well, you get what you give. And in this case, the clients will know that as well. There's many an organization that have gone under because they valued the delivery date above quality. And honestly, I don't know that anyone ever really remembers when you deliver something. Everyone remembers how good it was, though. So let's consider a different culture. What would it be like to create a testing culture? One where everyone in the company, I mean, every single person takes personal responsibility for the quality of everything that they touch. What would that sound like? What would that look like? How would it feel to be in that kind of an environment? What would you expect the impact to be for your customers and users? So take a moment, think about this, and type your thoughts into the chat. And then we'll continue. Here's an example of a different kind of culture, one that a company wanted new outcomes and they decided to try something drastic. Yahoo, like about 5-6 years ago, decided that they were going to eliminate the QA role. This is kind of interesting. I found this article in IEEE Spectrum a year later where it was a summary or a look back saying, hey, so how did your experiment go? It's been a year since you let go of all the QA people or that role. Now, to be clear, they eliminated the role, not necessarily the people. But the experiment itself discovered that, or uncovered that, there were fewer errors and faster deployment when they eliminated the test and QA roles. It's a great article. I highly recommend that you go and you look for this article. Here are some of the highlights. The software engineers at Yahoo are no longer permitted to hand off their completed code to another team for cross-checking. This forced the engineers to develop tools to automate the kinds of checks previously handled by teams of humans. The shift wasn't easy. It required some tough parenting, with no exceptions. We said no more training wheels, and it made a huge difference. We forced excellence into the process. These first 4 bullet points, think about the culture and the shift required to support this particular effort. Think about the shift in culture, the conversations going on between the employees to make this happen. This last little note here says, it turns out that when you have humans everywhere checking this, checking that, they add so much human error into the chain that when you take them out, even if you fail sometimes, overall, you're doing better. That's kind of a systems thinking view, a big picture that we often get lost in the day-to-day details, that we don't realize that having more humans in the process complicate things further. And by simplifying it, by removing some of these manual checks and steps, we actually make it easier to deliver higher quality. Let's do a quick recap of some of the things that we've already covered in prior modules. Agile teams deliver quality throughout all of their practices in the day-to-day. So Agile is a team sport focused on delivering the right things at the right time. Some of the many quality and testing activities that are built into Agile practices and frameworks include things like story card writing, the user stories, invest mnemonic, the independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. Wow, that T is right there. The 3 C's, do you recall what that is? Card, conversation, and confirmation. So how do we know when a user story is ready to be passed on to the team? You have had that conversation and you agree on what the confirmation criteria is. There is where acceptance testing is done before a single line of code is written. This is an example of how quality is built into the process. The customer collaboration piece is also tightly integrated into many of these practices. In Scrum, for instance, you have sprint reviews and demos. So we don't go more than like 1 or 2 weeks before we put what we've built in front of the users so that we can get some fast feedback. That's fantastic. Design thinking, UX, prototyping. There's an entire field, entire module that we covered earlier on this area of how we can have a hypothesis and generate prototypes to test those hypotheses and iteratively come up with designs that produce excellent results. Traditional functional verification is that when we look at the traditional QA or testing role, we bury ourselves in the documentation. And in the new Agile way of looking at things, we have the developer role. We have pairing that takes place. We have test-driven development, the automated tests, and continuous integration that can continuously check that the code we have delivered is of always high quality. It is meeting the expected needs for that software. We also can build in automated code quality checks right into our continuous integration process. We have this notion of collective code ownership. It's not my code versus your code, it's our code. How do we keep this space clean so that it's always maintainable and extendable, compatible, portable, things like that. And looking at the overall systems quality, we have the topics of DevOps and continuous delivery, where we're looking at the whole process going from the first line of code that you check in until it's in production. And we're going to optimize that entire process. Along the way, we might look at things like infrastructure as code. Well, do we always need the physical hardware? Or can we take those bits and bytes and put them into version control and spin them up whenever we need that as well? It's an interesting idea. Try that as an experiment. And lastly, overall continuous improvement. Let's just, as a team, take a look at how we do things and try an experiment. What's one piece that's slow or complicated, something that we can try to improve the performance of or reduce the variability, reduce some of the lag time or the mistakes that are coming out of those processes? That mindset that builds into the culture, that's what we're really looking for. So, recap, in Agile, the whole team is responsible for quality. That means every team member is a tester. Doesn't matter what you think their role is, everyone is a tester. And this is how we deliver quality together. Brian Merrick, one of the Agile Manifesto signatories, thought of a way to visualize different kinds of testing performed by teams. He came up with a 2x2 matrix. I like to look at it as an axis. So on the vertical axis, we go from the top, business-facing tests, things like, beta tests or checking prototypes. We need human feedback. There's no way to automate that kind of testing. Those are definitely more business-facing. And if we go down that vertical line, some tests that we do are more technology-facing. API calls or database checks is like, that's all technical mumbo-jumbo to most of your users. If we look at the horizontal axis, over on the right-hand side, we have critiquing the product or the design. Some of the tests that we do, let's say we put it in front of the user and say, hey, what do you think? They might say, well, it's nice, but it doesn't do this. Or it'd be really nice if we could also do this. So they're critiquing that design, saying something needs to change here. But if we move over to the left-hand side, we have supporting development. Some of the tests that we do are there to tell us that we've built it right. Things like, does the code even compile, right? On the right-hand side, our users assume that it compiles and it builds without errors. But on the left-hand side, we take a look at some of these checks that we have in development and we say, well, this is, yes, a test, this is a check, but it's supporting our development efforts. Did we build it right? On the right-hand side, did we build the right thing? Let's try a quick activity here. Taking a look at the quadrants, and Brian just numbered them so that we could talk about what's in each of these particular boxes. Let's take a look at quadrant 1, the first box in the bottom left-hand side. In the chat window, what I'd like you to do is type in, who do you think on the team, what role does the kind of testing that is more technology-facing and supports development? Also in the chat window, what kind of tests do you see them doing in that particular area? What kinds of tests do these team members do that are more technology-facing and supporting development? What about quadrant 2? In the chat window, type in who on the team, what roles do the kind of testing that supports development and is more business-facing, more user-facing, more customer-facing. What about quadrant 3? Who on your team does the kind of testing that's customer-facing and critiques the products, saying, these are the things we'd like to see in them. What kind of tests fall into that category or into that box? And then moving on to quadrant 4 here, this one's a little bit trickier. Who on your team does the kind of testing that critiques the product and is more technology facing? So more technical skills. All right. Let's move on to the answers, or some subset of answers. Brian's Agile Testing Matrix was really popularized by Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory in their Agile Testing books. Here's an example of their enhanced visualization. So in quadrant 1, more technology facing that supports the development, this is where we have your traditional programmers or developers. And the kinds of tests that you might see there are unit tests, component tests. In this area, the majority of these tests, all of the tests, should be automated. It makes sense. It fits. Treat the code like code, treat your tests like code. And that requires perhaps a different way of thinking about the development process for some people. In quadrant 2, who are the team members who do the kinds of testing that fall into quadrant 2? This is where you might have your traditional QA or testers, perhaps some BAs. In this quadrant, we have our functional tests. Functional tests is an interesting one because we are coding the functionality down in quadrant 1 as well. So it's kind of like two different layers of functional testing, but mostly it's like, does it do what it's supposed to do? We have the story tests. We might have the actual developed prototypes or simulations, things that were already developed, but now this is where we're going to come in and say, oh, this is what you expect it to do. Let's check that it does that. In quadrant 2, notice that it says the tests here should be automated and manual. Why is that? Well, some things like functional tests might be easy to automate, and this is where we leverage our programmers, our development team members to help. But the closer we get to our customers, the closer we get to business facing, we need humans to give us the answers. We're not sure. That kind of uncertainty you can't program into computers to test for us. So we do need to allocate some of our time to doing the kinds of tests that we're not entirely sure what the outcome is going to be. And because of that, we need humans to do that. In quadrant 3, we have our product owners, perhaps our BAs as well. What about our users? You know, when we talked about sprint reviews, we put the code or the software in the hands of our users. They're definitely business facing and they have their opinions on what they think the product should do. Who else in your organization? Well, what about salespeople? What about account managers? What about technical support? Anyone who talks to your users or your customers can help provide some feedback. You also see that usability testing is in here. Well, your UX designers, they're always out talking to the customers, the users. They're developing prototypes, developing ideas. They're iterating on design. They're collecting that feedback directly from the people. So it says manual in the top bubble, but that's because we need the people to provide us with that kind of feedback. Interesting note here about user acceptance testing. When we say user acceptance testing, it falls into quadrant 3 because user is the first part of that. In some organizations, I've seen that user acceptance testing is done in-house. I don't quite get that. In this case, we can split that definition and say in quadrant 2, you can do acceptance testing. That's where we're going to check that the features we promise to deliver work as expected. Acceptance testing is a little different from user acceptance testing. You need your users. Otherwise, don't put user in the front of that particular type of testing. What about quadrant 4? Critiques the product or design is more technology facing. Well, here's where we have some of our specialists. Performance and load testing specialists, our security specialists, other abilities like accessibility, internationalization, localization. You need people with expertise. And because we need people with that expertise, we can't automate it per se, but we can leverage tools and technology to automate certain portions of it. or to generate more information. So this is lower level, more technology facing, because oftentimes a lot of these are done under the covers or under the hood or the UI, but it critiques the design of the software or the system. So it's important for us to factor that into the big picture. And this is why Brian said, well, you know what? Everybody fits here somewhere. And I like this picture because it shows how we as a team can do different kinds of testing, and that's all right. And this is how we work together to complement each other and to say, let's truly try to understand what the current state of quality is for the products that we're delivering. If you want to learn a little bit more about some of these quadrants and the testing activities, I do recommend Lisa and Janet's books. Agile Testing was the first one, and the more creatively titled More Agile Testing. They also recently published the Agile Testing Condensed, which really captures a little bit more of the whole team approach. And I like how they asked for different contributors to add to those. So you may or may not find me in one of these books, but I'll leave that for you to find. If we say that the whole team is responsible for quality and everyone on the team performs testing activities, is there a place on a team for a tester? Well, yes, but only if they work differently. A good tester helps everyone on the team to explore and to understand the current quality and production readiness of the software system. They do not come in and do test cases. They do not create test plans. They do not use test case management tools that no one else on the team is going to use or touch. Those are waterfall tools. Those are things that are done when the QA people are in a different floor, building, city, continent, and they're working in isolation. Here on an agile team, we're encouraging the interaction, the collaboration. So all those testers that are out there who understand testing, we need you to help your team members better understand testing. One of the essential skills for a new tester, an agile tester, would be, can you work with the product owner or business analysts to help them define the acceptance criteria for stories and requirements? We need you to pair and help them to understand what a good test would look like. Can you pair with developers to write automated functional and acceptance tests? Now note that we're asking the testers to pair with the developers to write the automated functional and acceptance tests. We're not asking the testers to write those. The developers, they're responsible for the functional piece. The developers are responsible for delivering the functionality and the tests that demonstrate the functionality work. The developers don't really know a lot about testing, so they need the help of a tester. Pairing is the key here. Good tester also knows how to cooperatively create test strategies to help the team achieve the required testing coverage. Asking some of those what if questions or what about, what does the big picture look like? What does quality mean? How are we going to get there? Let's just whiteboard what that testing coverage would look like. Your team doesn't know how to communicate this, but a good tester does. A tester on an Agile team can also perform exploratory testing to gain insights into additional aspects of system quality. We'll talk more about exploratory testing in a few minutes. And just like all other teams, they help continually improve the team's processes and the delivery processes. What else? Let's bump it up a notch. What does a great tester look like in an Agile team? Well, I equate a good tester the same as a designer. So that earlier module that we had on design, you can look at the definitions of what is a good designer and apply those to a tester as well. A tester is someone who asks those what if questions and will perform those experiments. More importantly, it's someone who brings the team members together. So one of the first advanced skill here is actively seek out the three amigos, the developer, the product owner, and a tester, to discuss ambiguous or vague requirements so that we may reduce the uncertainty among the team members. Because the more vague it is, the more open it to interpretation it may be, the more likely we're going to get something wrong. A great tester also helps lead collaborative test design activities, such as discovery and specification workshops in BDD. That's what this picture is here in the bottom right corner, is that you're a facilitator for those testing conversations. And along the way, demonstrate testing techniques, tools, and approaches to team members so that you can help them to elevate their testing skills and effectiveness. Think about the product owner. Think about your developer. Is that one of the reasons they don't feel comfortable doing testing is because they don't know about the science of it. They don't know about the techniques, the tools, the tricks. Facilitate those conversations. Yes, a tester on an Agile team may assist with automation efforts, but it's kind of a myth that a tester on an Agile team is an automation specialist. No, a programmer or a developer is an automation specialist. We pay them to automate every single day. I don't believe in hiring a tester into a programming job unless they happen to be a programmer and that's what they want to do. A great tester, again, like on the prior slide, they will assist the developer. They will sit down with them. They will pair with them so that in the process we have excellent code and quality that's coming out of it. And lastly, a great tester also provides assistance and insights to improve the whole continuous testing process and effort. Let's talk a little bit about exploratory testing. This I labeled as an advanced technique. There's some misunderstanding and different interpretations of it. I describe it here as a way to rapidly learn something specific about a product or system. It's an advanced testing approach if you do it intentionally, and it requires rapid design techniques and structured learning. There's also the informal aspect of it. What is it not? It's not the ad hoc fly by the seat of your pants, I'm just randomly hitting the keys. That's monkey testing. Exploratory testing is not monkey testing. By definition, because this is rapid design and learning, it cannot be automated. Yes, we can use computers and technology to help us gain more information. It's assisting us, but it cannot be automated. It leverages human ingenuity and creativity in ways that computers cannot do. We have to see the patterns. We have to understand the connections between different ideas, interfaces, different objects within the software or system. And so that is where we really need someone to know what they're looking for and have an idea of what they're doing. Keep in mind that this is used by different team members at different times and in different ways. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So why this picture of a wall? Well, you could look at each of the user stories that we deliver, each of those little finite contained pieces of value that we deliver as each of those bricks. Well, we could perform exploratory testing within and around each of those deliverables. So in this way, exploratory testing is kind of like the mortar around the bricks. It tells us, oh, here's this thing, and we've got excellent unit tests that are automated, part of CI, that's in the brick. But how does it interface with the rest of the system? How does it communicate back and forth with the different components that are beside it, near it, around it, supporting it? Well, those are interesting questions. And we could perform exploratory testing to find the answers to those questions really quickly. So how would you go about doing it? Well, exploratory testing is focused testing or learning that may happen at any time prior to, during, or after development. A quick guide here, some things that you might need. One, what's the question? Why are we testing? What do you want to learn? Let's formulate that hypothesis. I like to look at this as kind of a mini scientific method here. Well, you need that guiding question. You need your hypothesis. Why am I looking at the system? What information are we looking for? This exploratory testing session, it might be time-boxed. It's often time-boxed, but sometimes it's not. It could go on for days, perhaps, on big complex questions. And the output from an exploratory testing session is knowledge. It's something we've learned. If you recall the Product Owner in a Nutshell video, Henrik Nyberg talks about different kinds of risk, project risk and other things. And knowledge risk is one of those. Well, to address knowledge risk, we have to learn. And exploratory testing is an effective way to do that. And again, we might leverage automation and computers to assist us with data gathering or some analysis, but this cannot be automated. So what does it look like when we are doing exploratory testing on an Agile team? Well, there's ways to do it as an individual or as whole teams. For instance, one common tool that we use whenever we're estimating a story, perhaps, and we are uncertain about whether or not we can employ this technology or deliver this, we just aren't sure. Well, we'll create a spike. We'll schedule like a little mini story to discover or learn or experiment with something so that we can learn more about that story. And then in the subsequent release or iteration, we can come back and we can say, this is what we learned. Now we have a better understanding of how to proceed, how to deliver on that particular story. Spikes are by definition exploratory testing sessions. We just use a different name for it. Also, let's say the whole team finishes their sprint a little bit earlier by maybe a day or so. And what if the whole team wants to say, well, we've delivered on our stories. How about if we take some dedicated time, maybe an afternoon, and we'll do a bug bash? All hands on deck, everyone comes, start poking around the system. We know it's fit for purpose, but we're going to look for things that were unexpected. And that's a great way to have a collaborative whole team approach to exploratory testing. You've got a time box, you've got a purpose, you're looking for a specific output, and leverage whatever tools and communication make sense to accomplish that. Collaboratively applied to help the whole team rapidly explore ideas during three amigo conversations and during BDD style discovery or specification workshops. We'll talk a little bit more about BDD in a moment. But the three amigos conversations, what does that mean? Well, that means if we have this time where we're uncertain of the interpretation of a particular story or how it should look or how it should work or how it might be used, this is a great time to get the developer and the tester and the product owner together to say, well, what should it do? How do we know? This is where exploratory testing, you have a given time box. We are here together right now. We have our question. How can we quickly get to an answer together? And this is where a great tester can facilitate that conversation efficiently and effectively. Elizabeth Hendrickson wrote a great book called Explore It. And I might recommend this book to you if you're interested in learning a little bit more about exploratory testing. Behavior-driven development, or BDD for short. BDD is a collaborative software development approach to simultaneously discover and deliver customer value. It's kind of weird because we often think of those two things as opposite ends of our sprint or development process. To simultaneously discover, that happens before we build something, and deliver, that happens after we've built something. So how is it that we're talking about a way for us as a team to approach doing discovery and delivery simultaneously to produce value? Well, it encourages teams to use specific concrete examples to describe the desired application behavior and to surface uncertainty. It requires a shift in how team members interact with each other. And here's the key. The answer is kind of given to you in the title. The focus is on the desired user behavior, not just general acceptance tests. So a little bit about BD versus ATDD. In some contexts, we're talking about the same thing. BDD is the same as ATDD, or acceptance test driven development. It's also the same as specification by example, in that we are coming together collaboratively as a team, business and IT, and anyone else that is relevant to this conversation, to say, what is it the user is expecting? What do we need? Well, acceptance testing is the same. The difference is, in one case, it's focused on the user behavior. And on other cases, it's about what is the system behavior. If we're talking about a team that's truly cross-functional, that has all layers within this team, that we're going to develop the user interface, the middleware, the back end, all of it, and we're going to deliver one complete story, top to bottom, all the way through, then we should be focused on user behavior. This is the desired user behavior, and we're going to deliver as a team so that that happens. However, what if we have an agile team that is not quite so cross-functionally formed, and let's say we have a front-end user team? Well, you might still talk about user behaviors, but the middleware or back-end teams or a database team, for instance, they're not going to be talking to the users, or the users aren't going to be using their interfaces. Their interfaces are system to system. In those cases, it's kind of the same activity. We still come together as a team to say, what does the system need to do? What are the expected outputs? But in that case, because it's not focused on the user behavior, we talk a little bit more about acceptance tests. BDD is made up of 3 main practices and 3 outcomes. It starts with the discovery process. Then we formulate the outputs into specific formats. And then once we have these specifically formatted examples, we might consider automation to try and close that loop. So in discovery, we come together as a whole team, and we're here to answer one question, which is what? We focus on what the user needs, what the user wants or expects, and we're only talking about the what. The output of this activity is shared understanding. In the formulation phase, we start to take some of what we've learned now and we put it into specific formats. It might be that given, when, then format that you've heard about. It might be specific wireframes. It might be a logic diagram that shows the way the business rules interact, and that would guide development, architecture, testing. So there are many types of examples that can come out of the formulation stage, and the outcome here are business readable specifications. The whole team understands precisely what the user wants. And it's important to know that the language of these business readable specifications is in the business language. It's in the user's language, not in technical jargon. It's the user's language. Again, think of the behavior-driven development. When we have these business readable specifications, then we can look at some of the tools in automation, and we can automate those. And then in the process, the outcome here is living documentation. What does that mean? That means that we came together to articulate the user's needs into specific examples, and now we're automating them. We are literally automating the requirements here. Yes, they kind of look like tests, but they're not tests in the traditional sense. The living documentation means that when one of these scenarios fails, your requirement has officially failed. The system is no longer performing what it was designed to do. In some cases, that might be okay because we're continuing to adapt and refine the system, but sometimes it's showing you, hey, no, someone made a change somewhere and one of these requirements is now failing. One of your users or customers is now going to be unhappy. So at a high level, this is now BDD. Important to note, the first 2 steps, discovery and formulation, in the traditional QA world, they would own the tests portion. In an agile team, this is owned by the business, the product owners, not QA, not developers, not testers. This isn't about who controls what, it's about clarifying ownership, that this whole process is around making sure we understand what the customer wants. And so that proxy, whether it's the user directly or whether it's their proxy, the product owner or BA, they're the ones that own the clarity of what these scenarios are, not QA. QA in this case, should you have a tester on your team, they're part of the delivery team focused on the automation or the delivery of these, but they don't own these tests. I know. This new culture world, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but here's some of the little changes that you might see when we're trying to implement these processes. All right, and one last note about BDD and automation. Warning, automation is not the goal of BDD. I know it's attractive, and a lot of people start to look at ATD and BDD and say, cool, this is what test automation looks like in Agile. I'm like, no, actually it's not. Shared understanding is the purpose of BDD. 90% of the value that we're going to get from this whole process of coming together is in making sure we're on the same page with what we need to deliver. The automation part, yes, it's cool, but it's more of a cherry on top of the sundae in this particular case. Also important to remember, automation is a development activity, not a testing one. It needs to be owned by the developers, prioritized at the same level as new functionality, and performed with all of the programming skills, tools, and experiences that programmers use for success. That means we're going to have it in version control, it's going to have code reviews or pairing, it's going to be plugged into the continuous integration process. And a little bit about the prioritized at the same level as new functionality. Well, if the deliverable is for completed stories, completed code that performs what it's supposed to do, the tests that validate that it's performing what it's supposed to do are delivered at the same time. Yes, to the business, to the product owners, this means that you will deliver less functionality so that we can have this higher quality artifacts and deliverables. The result is there is no more hidden time at the end where we do manual regression testing that is meant to go back and check, does it do what it's supposed to do? This replaces that whole process of the acceptance testing we might do prior to launch. This also lowers the risk and uncertainty of our deliverables because we know that when we deliver the functionality, it is fit for purpose. It is ready to go to production with confidence. So ask yourself, do you want to prioritize more and more new functionality at the expense of having this automation and it isn't there, and therefore increasing risk and uncertainty and instability? Or can we lower that rate of new functionality, but the ones that we do deliver comes with great confidence? And the last point here is just a reminder that every practice in BDD requires a collaborative team effort for success. Is that Agile's not an individual sport, it's a team effort. It's a team sport. Think about the culture. What would that look like? What would that sound like? How would that feel? How would that feel to your customers or your users who are going to be on the receiving end of these new deliverables? Some helpful references to go over some of the topics we've covered. For the discovery phase, there's Specification by Example and the older book, Bridging the Communication Gap by Gojko Atsik. I highly recommend these books. Spec by Example is more of a facilitation guide. How do we come together and collaborate in different ways? What does that look like? Bridging the Communication Gap is a little bit more about that discovery process. What do we do in the time when we come together? And it's about applying different kinds of techniques to get different kinds of outcomes. For the formulation step, I highly recommend Writing Great Specifications. This is an excellent guide. Cannot reference it enough. For the automation step, there are so many books out there, and it depends on the tool that you're going to use that makes sense for your technology and your context. The Cucumber book is a great place to start. The Cucumber and Cheese by Jeff Morgan is also a great step-by-step guide on how to use the Ruby programming language to get up and running to do some really cool things and demonstrate the power of automating some of these scenarios. Well, that's it for the testing module. What do you think? It's kind of shifted from being that one person to it's now on all of us. So think about the culture change required to make this successful. Good luck and happy experimenting.